Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, gotcha.
Brilliant. So we've had some interesting discussions already this afternoon. And first of all, thank you for inviting me along to speak to you today. My last trip pre-pandemic was actually to a conference in Exeter. So it's nice to be back with you, even if it is only virtually. And certainly, as we heard in the last discussion from Nigel, congestion and air quality are a major problem in many of our cities. So here we see Plymouth and Exeter on a typical day, maybe, in terms of the levels of congestion that you're probably very familiar with. And if you cast your mind back to March last year when we first went into lockdown, I don't know how the situation was in your part of the world, but certainly where I am in London, the traffic disappeared and there was virtually no traffic at all on the roads. And congestion costs us money. It costs us money not only in the sense of the amount of extra fuel you might consume if you're stuck in a traffic jam, but our time is also money. You could be doing lots of other more interesting things than sitting in a traffic jam with your time. You could be actually earning more money through working, or you could be at home with your family. So congestion costs us money. And as I said, we can put a value on that. And somebody has done that. And in the case of the UK, they reckon that the cost per driver of congestion decreased from £900 per person in 2019, pre-pandemic, down to just £291 post-pandemic. And I think what we saw and what we're still seeing to some extent in certain times of the day is that massive reduction in congestion. And obviously you're seeing your journeys speeded up. We also heard Nigel talking about air quality problems, and this is not a fuzzy picture. It is to some extent, but it is showing the haze and the smog over Plymouth. And although air quality is not particularly bad in Devon compared to other parts of the country, it is still an issue, and it's believed to cause or be a factor in about 5% of deaths in Exeter and Plymouth. So congestion obviously causes a financial cost. Air quality causes us a personal cost to us in terms of our health. Most people in Devon own a car, or most households have access to a car in Devon, but it's still noticeable that in certain parts, especially Exeter and Plymouth, anything up to 40–50% of households don't have a car. And often when we start talking about measures to try and manage car use, everybody immediately starts saying, well, that's going to impact mostly on poor elements of society. But actually, they're the parts of society that often don't have a car to begin with. And therefore, it's actually the wealthier people, and we'll come on to that in a second, that drive most and cause most of that congestion.
John, sorry to interrupt, just cutting out a little bit on the mic. I wonder if you could just ping it a bit closer, the mic. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'll try. Is it worth me trying to, oops, sorry, I've gone. Tell me if it cuts out again.
Yeah, keep going, don't worry, thank you.
So one of the issues about economics is all about how do you allocate scarce capacity. And this is a sort of classic picture that shows you how much road space different forms of transport take. So to move around 80 people, you can either move them all on that bus on the left-hand side. If everybody cycles, they take up a bit more room. But if everybody's in a car, then you've got 4 lanes of traffic stretching back a long way. So we have an inefficient use of the road network. And as we've seen, we've got air quality and congestion issues. So what has happened, and again, sort of Nigel referred to this to some extent in what he was saying, is that the government is talking about trying to address the air quality issues. And in London, we tackled both the congestion charging being introduced and introducing an ultra low emission zone to try and tackle both these problems. So in London's congestion charge, it operates only in the central part of London, where there is plenty of public transport available. It operates before COVID, and there have been some changes since then, but it operates from 7 in the morning till 6 in the evening. And when it was introduced, there were exemptions. So blue badge holders remain exempt even now. There were other exemptions for low emission vehicles and also for minicabs and taxis. And I'll come back to those in a second. And what we saw when the congestion charge was introduced almost 20 years ago now is that the number of cars entering central London during that period when the charge was in place reduced by about a third. Other types of transport weren't so much impacted. Vans, the lorries, the taxis, the buses, they were all going to be there anyway, and they continued operating to central London. Motorbikes were exempt, so they weren't really impacted. And what we saw was we took out more cars, then we saw an increase in bicycles. And going forward, what we saw is that traffic levels, it's quite difficult to see what the trend is here, but it is slightly decreasing until about 2018, 2019, when it changed quite a bit and started reducing even more. And that was in part because two changes were introduced. One, it was seen that actually all these mini cabs were replacing private cars, and we actually weren't seeing much reduction of traffic on the roads, and that was causing an issue. And also we started seeing the introduction of a low emission zone, which also reduced the amount of cars coming into central London. And one of the points that Steve was making about this suppressed demand, one of the things that London has done is to reallocate road space, to provide more road space for cycling, more road space for bus priority measures, bus lanes. There was a lot of investment made in buses to provide an alternative to those people who no longer wish to drive because of the introduction of a congestion charge. So it was trying to address both the air quality issues and also reallocating that road space away from cars and private vehicles. As I say, Devon doesn't really have a problem with air quality at the moment. It's sort of trying to address those issues and reduce the problems of air quality, but other major cities around the UK do. And a number of clean air zones are being brought forward, not only in London, but elsewhere. So this is the example in Birmingham. So Birmingham, again, in the very center of the city, has introduced a clean, what they call clean air zone. It was introduced at the beginning of last month. And what they sort of highlighted was that most of the lower income groups actually don't have access to a car in Birmingham, so they're not impacted by the charge. It's put in place on vehicles that don't meet the emission standards. And they also brought in some measures to provide exemptions from those people on lower wages. So under £30,000 a year, which is actually more than the average wage, they got a 2-year exemption from the charges. So to try and introduce the scheme gradually to change people's behaviour, to think about the use of the road network. And in terms of what's happened in London, so Birmingham, as I said, has only just been introduced, so it's a bit early to say what the impacts have been in London. But in Birmingham, but what's happened in London, we've seen a reduction in a third in terms of pollution from nitrogen dioxide. And equally important, we've seen no increase in pollution on the boundary roads around the low emission zone. And often people get concerned about traffic being moved from one place to another, but that hasn't happened in London. You've also seen a big change in the number of vehicles which are compliant with those emission standards. So back in 2017, only 39% of vehicles entering central London were compliant. That's now up to 77%. And as we saw on one of the previous graphs, there's been, again, a slight decline in the amount of traffic, overall traffic coming into London. And again, a big reduction in carbon dioxide emissions as a result of that particular policy. So what we've seen is by introducing a charge, we've changed people's behaviours. We've reduced the amount of people driving into London, and other cities around the world have seen the same. So Singapore, New York, Stockholm, Oslo are all either introduced or about to introduce road user charging. It's all aimed at persuading people not to drive their cars in, to switch over to using public transport or cycling. And on the low emission zones, again, what we've seen is policies put in place to nudge people by having a charge if their vehicles don't meet the required standards, but also putting in other measures to help people either give up their vehicles or to scrap their vehicles and get less polluting vehicles. So just by having a small charge, London is very expensive, and I wouldn't recommend you introduce that sort of level of charging to Devon. But just a small charge, I think you might recall way back can't remember how many years ago it was now, when we introduced the tax or the charge on using plastic carrier bags. A 5p charge, a 5p coin, a coin that probably many of you wouldn't pick up if you saw it on the street. But that changed behaviours dramatically. It reduced the use of plastic bags by around 90%. So just a small charge can make a big difference into people's behaviours. And this is what we're sort of suggesting could be used as a way of getting people out of their cars, especially for those shorter journeys. And, you know, to address both the sort of congestion, the air qualities, and obviously the wider issue of climate change. So that was all I was going to say, a sort of very brief overview. And
Great.